Branching pattern and distribution of the renal arteries in native domestic animals: donkey, buffalo, camel, goat, and dog. General considerations. In most domestic animals, the right and left renal arteries arise from the lateral aspects of the abdominal aorta, positioned just caudal to the origin of the cranial mesenteric artery. In dogs, these arteries emerge from the ventrolateral side of the abdominal aorta. Typically, the right renal artery is slightly longer and originates more cranially than the left renal artery. Upon reaching the renal sinus, the renal arteries branch into primary vessels, which can differ significantly across species. Variations may also be observed between the two sides of the same animal and among individuals of the same species. In the donkey's kidneys, both the right and left renal arteries arise from a single, prominent stem located on the respective lateral aspects of the abdominal aorta. It is noteworthy that the right renal artery originates slightly more cranially than the left. The right renal artery branches into two primary divisions, each of which gives rise to both dorsal and ventral secondary branches. Conversely, the left renal artery has three primary branches: cranial, middle, and caudal. The cranial and caudal branches supply blood to the respective poles of the kidney, while the middle branch is further divided into dorsal and ventral branches. A photograph of a donkey's kidneys, illustrating the origin and extra-renal branching patterns of the renal arteries. 1. Abdominal aorta, aorta abdominalis. 2. Right renal artery, A. renalis dexter. 3. Right cranial branch, ramus cranialis dexter. A. Ventral branch, ramus ventralis. B. Dorsal branch, ramus dorsalis. 4. Right hilar branch. 5. Dorsal branch of the right hilar branch, ramus dorsalis de right hilar branch. 6. Ventral branch of the right hilar branch, ramus ventralis de right hilar branch. 7. Caudal branch of the right renal artery, ramus caudalis de A. renalis dexter. 8. Left renal artery, A. renalis sinister. 9. Left cranial branch, ramus cranialis sinister. 10. Left hilar branch, A. Ventral branch of the left hilar branch, ramus ventralis of the left hilar branch. B. Dorsal branch of the left hilar branch, ramus dorsalis of left hilar branch. 11. Caudal branch of the left renal artery, ramus caudalis de A. renalis sinister. C. Ventral branch of the caudal branch, ramus ventralis de ramus caudalis. D. Dorsal branch of the caudal branch, ramus dorsalis de ramus caudalis. In a rare anatomical variation, the left renal artery emerges from three distinct branches on the left side of the abdominal aorta. These branches consist of a small caudal branch that penetrates the renal tissue at the caudal pole, a medium-sized cranial branch that supplies the cranial pole, and a large hilar branch that extends toward the renal hilus. The hilar branch subsequently divides into dorsal and ventral branches. A photograph of a donkey's kidneys, showing the origin and branching pattern of the renal arteries. 1. Abdominal aorta, aorta abdominalis. 2. Right renal artery, A. renalis dexter. 3. Right cranial branch, ramus cranialis dexter. 4. Dorsal branch of the right hilar branch, ramus dorsalis de right hilar branch. 5. Ventral branch of the right hilar branch, ramus ventralis of right hilar branch. 6. Caudal branch of the right renal artery, ramus caudalis de A. renalis dexter. 7. Cranial branch of the left renal artery, ramus cranialis de A. renalis sinister. 8. Left hilar branch dividing into A. Dorsal branch of the left hilar branch, ramus dorsalis of left hilar branch. and B. Ventral branch of the left hilar branch, ramus ventralis of left hilar branch. 9. Caudal branch of the left renal artery, ramus caudalis. A. Renally sinister, dividing into C. Dorsal branch of the caudal branch, ramus dorsalis de ramus caudalis, and D. Ventral branch of the caudal branch, ramus ventralis de ramus caudalis. In most cases, the right renal artery gives rise to a relatively small primary cranial branch that extends toward the renal hilus, entering directly into the cranial pole of the right kidney. The continuation of the right renal artery produces one or two hilar branches, along with a primary caudal branch. This caudal branch penetrates the caudal pole of the right kidney, while the hilar branch divides into dorsal and ventral branches that supply the corresponding regions of the middle renal area. The left renal artery, upon its origin from the abdominal aorta, branches into three primary divisions. These include a left cranial branch that supplies the cranial renal pole, a left caudal branch that serves the caudal renal pole, and a left hilar branch that further divides into dorsal and ventral branches directed toward the renal sinus, supplying the middle renal region. A photograph of a donkey's kidneys, illustrating the origin and branching patterns of the renal arteries. 1. Abdominal aorta, aorta abdominalis. 2. Right renal artery, A. renalis dexter. 3. Right cranial branch, ramus cranialis dexter, dividing into A. ramus ventralis and B. ramus dorsalis. 4. Right hilar branch. 5. Ramus ventralis of the right hilar branch. 6. Ramus dorsalis of the right hilar branch. 7. Ramus caudalis dexter dividing into C. ramus ventralis of the ramus caudalis, and D. ramus dorsalis de the ramus caudalis. 8. A. renally sinister. 9. Ramus cranialis sinister. 10. Ramus ventralis of the left hilar branch. 11. Ramus dorsalis of the left hilar branch. 12. Ramus caudalis sinister. In an alternative description, the left renal artery bifurcates into four primary branches before reaching the renal sinus. These branches comprise a left cranial branch that supplies the cranial renal pole, a left caudal branch that services the caudal renal pole, and two hilar branches that extend into the renal hilus, further subdividing toward the middle renal region. A photograph of a left donkey's kidney, illustrating the origin and branching pattern of the renal arteries. 1. Left renal artery, arteria renalis sinistra. 2. Cranial branch, ramus cranialis, that dividing into A. Dorsal branch, R. dorsalis, and B. Ventral branch, R. ventralis. 3. Caudal branch, ramus caudalis. 4. Ventral hilar branch. 5. Dorsal hilar branch. 6. Ureter. Within the renal tissue, in both the right and left kidneys, each of the three primary branches further divides into dorsal and ventral secondary branches, resulting in a total of 6 secondary branches for each kidney. From these secondary branches, interlobar arteries emerge, extending into the medullary tissue up to the medullary cortical junction, where they curve to form arcuate arteries. Interlobular arteries arise from the arcuate arteries, establishing a sequential branching pattern of renal arterial distribution. This radiograph illustrates the left kidney of a donkey in a dorsoventral view, highlighting the branching pattern and distribution of the left renal artery. 1. Left renal artery, A. renally sinister. 2. Left cranial branch, ramus cranialis sinister. 3. Left hilar branch. 4. Left caudal branch, ramus caudalis sinister. 5. Left cranial ventral branch, ramus ventralis cranialis sinister. 6. Left cranial dorsal branch, ramus dorsalis cranialis sinister. 7. Ramus ventralis of the left hilar branch. 8. Ramus dorsalis of the left hilar branch. 9. Left caudal ventral branch, ramus ventralis caudalis sinister. 10. Left caudal dorsal branch, ramus dorsalis caudalis sinister. A. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. B. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. C. Interlobular arteries, arteriae interlobulares. The number of interlobar arteries that originate from the 6 secondary divisions in both kidneys may vary, typically ranging from 19 to 22 in each kidney. Some interlobular arteries penetrate the fibrous capsule to supply blood to the perirenal fat. This radiograph depicts the right kidney of a donkey in a dorsoventral view, highlighting the branching pattern and distribution of the right renal artery. 1. Right renal artery, A. renalis dextra. 2. Cranial primary branch, ramus cranialis dexter. 3. Hilar branch. 4. Caudal primary branch, ramus caudalis dexter. 5. Dorsal secondary branch of the cranial primary branch, ramus dorsalis. 6. Ventral secondary branch of the cranial primary branch, ramus ventralis. 7. Dorsal hilar branch, ramus dorsalis of the right hilar branch. 8. Ventral hilar branch, ramus ventralis of the right hilar branch. 9. Dorsal secondary branch of the caudal primary branch, ramus dorsalis caudalis dexter. 10. Ventral secondary branch of the caudal primary branch, ramus ventralis caudalis dexter. A. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. B. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. C. Interlobular arteries, arteriae interlobulares. A radiograph of a donkey's kidneys, viewed from a dorsoventral perspective, illustrates the branching pattern and distribution of the left renal artery. The components are labeled as follows. 1. Left renal artery, A. renalis sinister. 2. Cranial primary branch of the left renal artery, ramus cranialis sinister. 3. Dorsal branch of the left hilar branch, ramus dorsalis of the left hilar branch. 4. Ventral branch of the left hilar branch, ramus ventralis of the left hilar branch. 5. Caudal primary branch of the left renal artery, ramus caudalis sinister. In buffaloes, as in other domestic animals, the right and left renal arteries arise from the abdominal aorta. Upon reaching the renal sinus, each renal artery branches into a short primary cranial branch and a longer caudal branch. The shorter cranial primary branch enters the kidney at its cranial pole. A radiograph further divides into dorsal and ventral secondary branches, displaying the branching. In contrast, pattern the longer caudal primary of the right renal gives rise to middle dorsal right and ventral secondary branches that supply the middle region of the kidney. Cranial primary branch, ramus cranialis dexter. 3. Caudal primary branch, ramus caudalis dexter. 4. Secondary branches of cranial primary branch. 5. Middle secondary arteries. 6. Secondary branches of caudal primary branch. A. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. B. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. C. Interlobular arteries, arteriae interlobulares. The caudal primary branch advances towards the caudal pole of the kidney, where it bifurcates into dorsal and ventral secondary renal branches. These branches subsequently branch out into the dorsolateral and ventromedial regions of the caudal pole. Interlobar arteries, originating from the secondary renal branches, travel towards the cortical medullary junction, where they form arcuate arteries. From these arcuate arteries, multiple interlobular arteries enhance the vascularization of the renal cortical tissue. A radiograph of a left buffalo's kidney dorsal view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the left renal artery. 1. Left renal artery, A. Renally sinister. 2. Cranial primary branch, ramus cranialis sinister. 3. Caudal primary branch, ramus caudalis sinister. 4. Secondary branches of cranial primary branch. 5. Middle secondary arteries. 6. Secondary branches of caudal primary branch. A. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. B. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. C. Interlobular arteries, arteriae interlobulares. In the camel, the renal artery in each kidney, whether on the right or left side, bifurcates into ventral and dorsal primary branches before entering the hilum. Each of these primary branches is subsequently divided into cranial and caudal secondary branches. The shorter cranial secondary branch typically gives rise to 5 to 6 interlobar arteries, whereas the longer, curved caudal secondary branch produces 6 to 8 interlobar arteries. A radiograph positive photo of a left camel's kidneys, ventral view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the left renal artery. Left renal artery, A. Renally spinster. 2. Ventral primary branch, ramus ventralis. 3. Dorsal primary branch, ramus dorsalis. 4. Cranial secondary branch, ramus cranialis dexter. 5. Caudal secondary branch, ramus caudalis. 6. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. A. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. B. Interlobular arteries, arteriae interlobulares. Consequently, each kidney contains a total of 11 to 14 interlobar arteries distributed across both its dorsal and ventral surfaces. At the corticomedullary junction, each interlobar artery further divides into arcuate arteries, from which multiple interlobular arteries originate to supply the cortical tissue. A radiograph positive photo of a right camel's kidneys, ventral view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the right renal artery. 1. Right renal artery, A. Renalis dexter. 2. Ventral primary branch, ramus ventralis. 3. Dorsal primary branch, ramus dorsalis. 4. Cranial secondary branch, ramus cranialis dexter. 5. Caudal secondary branch, ramus caudalis. 6. Interlobar arteries, arteriae interlobares. A. Arcuate arteries, arteriae arcuatea. B. In the goats, the renal artery emerges from the lateral aspect of the abdominal aorta and bifurcates into 2 primary branches prior to reaching the hilum, the dorsal primary branch and the ventral primary branch. At the hilum, each primary branch further divides into 2 secondary branches. The dorsal primary branch separates into the cranial secondary branch and the middle secondary branch, while the ventral primary branch divides into its own middle secondary branch and the caudal secondary branch. A radiograph of a right goat's kidney, ventral view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the right ventral primary branch of renal artery. 1. Right renal artery. 2. Dorsal primary branch. 3. Ventral primary branch. 4. Cranial secondary branch. 5. Middle secondary branch of dorsal primary branch. 6. Middle secondary branch of ventral primary branch. 7. Caudal secondary branch. 8.A interlobes. 9. The cranial secondary branch of the dorsal division gives rise to 5 interlobar arteries that supply the cranial pole of the kidney. Meanwhile, the middle secondary branch of the dorsal primary division produces 2 branches for the middle region of the kidney. Conversely, the middle secondary branch of the ventral primary branch supplies 2 interlobar arteries to the middle region, while the caudal secondary branch of the ventral division generates 5 interlobar arteries that supply the caudal pole of the kidney. These interlobar arteries subsequently branch into arcuate arteries, which traverse the cortical medullary border. The arcuate arteries then give a radiograph of a right goat's kidney, ventral view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the right renal artery. 1. Right renal artery, A. Renalis dexter. 2. Ventral primary branch. 3. Dorsal primary branch. 4. Middle secondary branch of ventral primary branch. 5. Caudal secondary branch of ventral primary branch. 6. Cranial secondary branch of dorsal primary branch. 7. Caudal secondary branch. 8. A. interlobes. 9. A. arcuate. 10. A. interlobulares. 11. R. capsularis. 12. Branch in the dogs. The renal arteries originate from the ventrolateral aspect of the abdominal aorta and branch into dorsal and ventral primary divisions before reaching the hilum of the kidney. Each primary branch further subdivides into 2 secondary branches as it approaches the hilum. A photograph of kidneys of a dog showing the site of the origin of the renal arteries from the ventrolateral aspect of the abdominal aorta. RK. Right kidney, LK. Left kidney, AA. Abdominal aorta, CAN. Cranial mesenteric artery, RRA. 8. Renal artery, LRA. The dorsal primary branch divides into cranial and middle secondary branches, while the ventral primary branch splits into middle and caudal secondary branches. The cranial secondary branch of the dorsal primary division gives rise to 6 interlobar arteries that supply the cranial pole of the kidney. The middle secondary branch of the dorsal primary branch supplies 2 arteries for the mid-region of the kidney. Furthermore, the middle secondary branch of the ventral primary branch generates 2 interlobar arteries that nourish the middle region, while the caudal secondary branch of the ventral division produces 6 interlobar arteries aimed at the caudal pole of the kidney. A radiograph of a right dog's kidney, ventral view, displaying the branching pattern and distribution of the right renal artery. 1. A. Renalis dexter. 2. Dorsal primary branch. 3. Ventral primary branch. 4. Cranial secondary branch. 5. Middle secondary branch of dorsal primary branch. 6. Middle secondary branch of ventral primary branch. 7. Caudal secondary branch. 8. A. interlobes. 9. A. arcuate. 10. A. interlobulares. 11. R. capsularis. 12. Branch to the perirenal fat. These interlobar arteries then further divide into arcuate arteries along the corticomedullary border. The arcuate arteries subsequently branch into interlobular arteries that traverse the renal cortex to supply the glomerular vessels. A radiograph of a right dog's kidney, dorsal view, showing the branching pattern and distribution of the renal artery. 1. A. Renalis dexter. 2. Dorsal primary branch. 3. Ventral primary branch. 4. Cranial secondary branch. 5. Middle secondary branch of dorsal primary branch. 6. Middle secondary branch of ventral primary branch. 7. Caudal secondary branch. 8. A. interlobes. 9. A. arcuate. 10. A. interlobulares. 11. Branch to the perirenal fat. I hope you enjoyed with our e-learning modules. We are waiting for your evaluation via the answering of the provided survey. Thanks a lot. Developers team.